Hey, welcome to Q&A with J.P. I'm Bub Coons. This is our pastor, J.P. Jones. We are on the last episode of the eschatology series, the brief eschatology series, but it's really, really good. Recommend that you go back and see the first three. This last one is, well, since Jesus is coming back, we believe it, the Bible teaches it, how should we be living?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, and that's the one that really matters, because how we live is how we demonstrate that we're followers of Jesus Christ. And we've joked about this, that, some people take the reaction that, well, let's head for the hills then, or let's buy a bunch of freeze-dried food, or let's prepare for apocalyptic times, or, whatever it is. Jesus is really clear in Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. It's called the Olivet Discourse. Jesus is teaching about his second coming in Matthew 24, verses, 1 to 31. He talks about these are the signs, and then this is it. I come back. And then he follows it with some really clear teaching about how we ought to live. He says we ought to be faithful. We ought to be ready. We ought to live holy lives. We ought to be doing what he's called us to do in obedience. He even gives a couple of these parables or illustrations of what he means. He talks about the guy who gives certain amounts of money to people and tells them to be good stewards of it, and then he comes back and says, what'd you do with it? He gives the parable of, and this has context in the time that Jesus gave it, virgins who are waiting for the bridegroom, and some had their lamps fully ready. They had oil in it, and some didn't. And then he gives a teaching about when the king comes back and he separates the sheep from the goats. And each of those parables or illustrations teach the same thing. We need to be faithful stewards of everything that God has given to us. We need to be obedient to everything God's told us, and we need to be ready because it could happen at any time.
Yeah, I love that. We should always be living like that, whether he's going to return or not. It's funny when I used to talk to my wife about this stuff, and she goes, Jesus is coming back. We don't know that, but I guarantee you're going to meet him probably within 100 years. So he's coming back a lot sooner than even if you think he's never coming. Well, you're going to die, and you're going to meet him. So in some way, that's right. So how should you live? Because you're going to meet Jesus one way or the other, whether he comes back now and you happen to be alive, or whether it's another 20, 40 years, but you're still going to meet him face to face. So that even though that is following the prophetic word of Jesus and how you should live, it's really no different, right?
Right.
It's like, hey, you're a Christ follower. You should always be faithful to what I'm giving you. You should be ready, and all the same things are true. Why do you think he magnifies it like that? Because people have a tendency to, when it gets scary and in times, they throw their hands up and do other things?
Well, it's interesting to me, and I've been teaching the Bible most of my adult life, is that this particular topic, for whatever reason, people get enamored with the information, not with the application of the information. So they'd rather spend time figuring out some scheme of chronology.
Right. Figure out the
Or
date.
debate somebody who doesn't agree with them on their scheme of chronology, rather than stepping away and saying, now, if I was just to keep the main thing, Jesus is coming back, and I need to live now in a way that I can fully anticipate receiving, well done, my good and faithful servant. You start with the end and work backwards. So the end is exactly what you said. We're going to meet Jesus. Either he's going to come back in our lifetime, or we're going to physically die and immediately go into the presence of the Lord. So for however long I have to live until that moment, how can I live that time making a kingdom investment, storing up treasures in heaven, living with a clear conscience, loving God, loving people, being obedient to God's commandments, faithfully using every resource that God has given me to exalt God and bless other people. I mean, it's really not that complicated,
right.
but it's far more challenging, I think. It's far more challenging to determine to live that way and do it than it is to just talk about the end times.
Right. Or they can also think it's the last 5 days I can clean my life up and go this really hardcore, this last part, and I'll show. And it's like, well, you don't know. The $1 million question here, wrapping up the whole series. I've often wondered, because here's Christian living, here's what you're supposed to be doing anyway. Why does Jesus talk about coming back at all? Is it for hope? Is it for
yes?
He could go, I'm coming back. But he didn't have to go into detail of what's going to happen before. Why did he give us these signs?
Now, I think you're right. If all Jesus wanted is us to be living faithfully and obediently, he could have just commanded us, live faithfully and
Right.
obediently. But I think Paul is the one who gives us the answer. I mean, it's still Jesus
Sure.
speaking
Well, sure,
through Paul.
sure.
But in 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, large portions of chapter 4, chapter 5 in 1 Thessalonians, chapter 1, chapter 2, and 2 Thessalonians are devoted to this doctrine of the second coming of Jesus Christ. And at the end of the teaching, it says, therefore, comfort one another with these words. It's written to people who are struggling in this world, and the struggle is either existentially real, I mean, there's suffering and there's trials and tribulations, or it's an internal struggle of, is this all there is? But to either of those struggles, Jesus is saying, no, reality is with me for all eternity. And it's going to happen. So comfort one another with these words. So Jesus is, I think, teaching about his second coming. I think it's about giving us hope that this world is not our home. Heaven is our home, and we're all going there if we believe in Jesus.
And it will be righted. All this it will be set back to the course and will be redeemed, fixed, or however you want to say that. And that's requires his physical second coming for all that stuff to happen.
Yeah, because he comes back as King, Savior, and Judge.
Yeah.
He will judge all evil.
Right.
So all of those questions, why
that.
does suffering happen? Why does evil happen? Why do these people seem to have it easy and other people have it hard? It'll all be made clear when Jesus comes back, and he's going to wipe away every tear, and we're going to be with him forever.
Yeah, that's big. All right, there you go. Thanks for joining us. Really recommend you watching all these together and sharing them with your friends because it's important stuff. Comfort one another, knowing that Jesus is going to return. Adios.